How's it going?
So my good, super good friends, the Ferraras.
Ferraras, yep.
Yes, asked me to say hello to you.
Yes,
Yeah, I didn't
and-
realize you're.
Yes, we're colleagues on the Acton Democratic Town
Yes,
Committee.
right, yeah. Bob and Dean have been very close friends for, 40 years, so.
Yeah, they're absolutely wonderful folks.
Yeah,
and,
really nice
we're,
people.
We're fortunate to have them, serving our community in Acton for so long.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
So-
We always get angry with Bob because he's got some kind of, meeting with that group on Sundays and
Every
stuff.
s-
We're trying to
every
get
other
him to-
Sunday, it seems
Or
like.
every other Sunday, yeah, right, exactly. I do want to ask you something. You step up?
Yeah,
maybe?
sure.
So do we have a consensus on adjourning after item 5?
It's 6. It's
Item 6, okay.
Item 6. Erica just said it's item 6.
That works.
I think,
It's
yeah.
shaping up to be a long meeting, it looks
Yeah,
like.
Jason is happy to stay, so.
Yeah. So, has everything been going? Good.
Busy.
Yeah, I'm sure. So,
How are you?
doing well. This was down in Port Washington this weekend with visiting Lauren and her husband. They live out on Long Island,
Okay.
and they're doing well. And I understand Tara's engaged, right?
Afternoon is still
Yeah.
nice, but that's tight.
Well, I already sent it to him, so it should be
Okay.
okay.
Okay,
I'm
good.
next to you, yay!
All right, good to see you, sir. Good.
You're gonna have to bug, I think, Emily over
Yeah.
in Linfield. My wife is trying to
So George,
nudge her along,
so-
but she's.
So many things going on.
Item 6.
But,
Yeah, yeah, I will.
Okay.
I definitely will.
Jason will stay back.
Excellent.
Hey, good. Good to see you.
Hello over there.
He'll have to change tags, name tags.
Hey, Dave.
Oh, slide over one, how's that? Saw Ken, I wanted to say hi.
Oh, that's also, I use the men's room in the lobby.
Yeah.
That toilet is blowing out water under the basement.
We had a problem earlier, so I just noticed that in the men's room that
I don't know if you've done this, but we have
there's
an
a
owl.
backup happening, so.
Seen the owl?
Okay.
It's, so when they can't get coverage, there's some like remote thing.
The drain issue is resurfaced.
It's cool, it looks like an owl. And when somebody speaks, it goes right to them. And so I'll activate.
I don't think I have it.
Oh, hey, man.
People, I don't see anybody. But this thing's recording and it's streaming, you know? Yeah, so.
Yeah, I will,
Someone will say, I'm like, we're recording now? Yeah, it was announced. Hello?
It's got everything in it.
I don't know which one it is.
2 points.
So you guys all roll in from work right to these meetings, right?
So the number I
pretty
call
much.
you, is that your home number?
That's my,
I get to bring the car home, so I just,
Personal one. Okay, so that's a good one to call.
yes, yeah.
I'm not gonna use my card.
Yeah, no,
Do
no,
we set
that's
down
good.
my
I
book?
know, yeah, it's very diverse. 1 out of 15, huh?
6 or 6:05. I'll call the meeting of the Reading Municipal Light Department Board of Commissioners to order, and this meeting of the Reading Municipal Light Department Board of Commissioners is being recorded at RMLD's office, 230 Ash Street, Reading, for distribution to the community television stations in Reading, North Reading, Wilmington, and Linfield, as well as live streamed on RCTV and YouTube. The RMLD Board of Commissioners recognizes the importance of hearing public comment at the discretion of the chair on terms on the official agenda. Once recognized by the chair, all persons addressing the board shall state their name and address prior to speaking. It is the role of the chair to maintain order in all public comment or ensuing discussion. Are there any remote participants, Erica? Nope. Okay. And Mr. Pacino will be serving as the board secretary. So are there any liaisons? Hi, Hamid. No? Okay. And, no, and that's it for public comment, because it's just Hamid. Okay.
And I'd like to just,
Hi, Vivek.
Hi.
Welcome, the
Yeah.
cab. Hi, guys.
yeah, I'd like to call the cab to order. You can go ahead. Thank you.
So do you want to do the motion to rates? Well, suggested motion on the action item to approve the rates. Sure, I'll give it, you can read this one.
Oh, which one? Oh, okay, it's over here.
The purple.
Is that
Oh,
the
yeah.
citizen advisory board motion first?
Yes.
Okay, so what we can do is, so do we have a motion?
It's in the agenda, it's on
Yeah.
the top of the second page.
Yep, it's on the back of the first page.
Back of the-
Yeah, so, yeah, there's a motion.
Oh, that too.
I'll make the motion.
Yeah, so, okay, please.
Move that the Citizens Advisory Board recommend that the Board of Commissioners vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to replace the following MDPU rates effective for billings on or after March 1st, 2023. Replace 277 EV Equipment Schedule with 306. Replace 296 Residential Schedule A with 301. Replace 299 Residential Time of Use Schedule A2 with 302. Replace 297 Commercial Schedule C with 303. Replace 298 Industrial Time of Use Schedule I with 304. Replace 300 School Schedule SCH with 305.
I second
Yeah,
that.
Thank you.
Second?
So, yeah, so we got a
So we can
second.
also.
I can't say it, you have to
You
say
can't
it.
say
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
You got a
I'm sorry,
second.
we're the
You got-
CAB meeting.
yeah.
I'm sorry, totally forgot.
Yeah. So we got a second, and now we can have a discussion, right? Or, but we need, yeah.
Ready for the discussion? Or do you want to do the BOC?
We do them in parallel or in
wanna do them
tandem? What, how do
Usually-
you,
I think in this case,
is there a
you
wrong way? So we can just,
I think we should do them at the same. I'll read
Yeah,
the
because-
motion.
I think we should do them simultaneously, would be my
Board of
recommendation.
Commissioners on recommendation of Citizen Advisory, when they make it, vote to accept the general manager's recommendation to replace the following MDPU rates effective on billings on or after March 1st, 2023. Replace 177 EV equipment schedule with 306. Replace 296 residential schedule A with 301. Replace 299 residential time of use schedule A2 with 302. Replace 297 commercial schedule C with 303. Replace 298 industrial time of use schedule I with 304. Replace 300 school schedule SCH with 305. That's gotta come back, that's gotta come back.
John or Bob seconded. What?
Well, yeah, Dave seconded it.
Dave did. I'm just helping Erica, yep.
Yeah. Vivek, why don't you pass that?
Okay. So if any further discussion, and we are excited for Greg's presentation on this, actually,
Great.
which
Right,
is
so you-
different than what we saw.
Well, back in December, we had presented to both the Citizens Advisory Board and the Board of Commissioners a proposed rate revisions, same rates that we have here. But at the end of the day, the average would have been roughly around 14%. And we went through a long discussion in terms of the reason behind that. And then we had a discussion in terms of what things could we look at to potentially reduce that 14% to a lower number. Oops. Yep.
So, Greg, so this is the third discussion on this subject. So actually what would be helpful is if you can remind us what we had when the first budget was proposed, right? There was a rate discussion planned in that. Then we had the December discussion, and now this is the third discussion. So just help us,
Sure.
understand the logic of each of these and why this is the best.
Okay, so what we ended up doing in the very first budget proposal, the implied rate increase would be just over 10%. And if we ended up sticking with that just over 10%, it would have left our cash position or our net income position, and again, net income is not cash, but would have left our cash position relatively speaking low, like under $1 million, where normally we would try and end up in a position where our net income was in the range of $3 to $4 million. That in itself was not a huge issue, except that we have a significant capital budget, both in 2023 and 2024, partially due to substation, partially due to significantly more expensive transformers and other equipment. So the second, so that was the original piece. We came back, and as we went, so that was the assumption on the first discussion. We didn't do a formal rate presentation, but that was the implication. We came back and said, look, we think it'd be more prudent to increase that closer to the $3 to $4 million. And so the recommendation was, instead of doing 10%, to do roughly 14% on average. Again, there's a lot of numbers behind it, but that's the big picture. That would leave us, again, lots of assumptions, but that would basically leave us just under $4 million of net income for 2023. And at the cab discussion, again, we talked about a bunch of different alternatives, but we thought that it would be prudent to move forward with that 14%. We had a follow-on discussion with the Board of Commissioners, and while conceptually the concept was good, the question was, what avenues could be applied to reduce that number some amount, right? And so we took the action, so that was the second wave. And so where we are today is we took the action item of looking at a couple of alternatives to reduce the increase for the ratepayers, and obviously the ratepayers in this case, are all 4 towns, all rate classes, and there's a whole bunch of detail, and we just went through some of this right now in terms of detail. So that's kind of where we were. So where we are today, to kind of set the stage, so that was a good setup. So when we had put together both of those discussions, we were working off of, so let me take a step back. Actually, why don't you go back a slide? Let me go to the slide, one more slide back. I'm not going to go through all the detail, but when you think about, so, hey, look at that, Lee. I have to stay close to the microphone, sorry. But in that far right-hand column, energy is a key variable, and energy is roughly 30% of our expenses and roughly 30% of customer bills. So just put that 30% in mind. It is a key leverage point. We can leave that there for right now. Back in September, September was basically the peak of the forward price curve, or the energy market, into 2023, and for that matter, 2024. 2023, back in September of 2022, was forecasted to be very expensive on the forward price curve. The forward price curve is basically the prices that we would pay for our open position. If you remember from our discussions, power supply, between the power supply is 2/3 to 3/4 of our total cost structure. Capacity and transmission, while there's variabilities, they don't oscillate as much as the energy market is right now. And from the other discussions that we've had before, given the ability to transport LNG in particular from the United States into Europe, and given the status of Russia's invasion into the Ukraine and Russia's subsequent, and the Europeans' intention to reduce imports into the EU of Russian oil and natural gas, they looked for other sources. There's a bottom line. It is what happens in Europe has an impact in terms of our energy prices here in New England, and for that matter, the United States, but particularly for us in New England. So by the time we got to September of last year, there was uncertainty in terms of how cold this winter would be, and there was also, at that point in time, relatively low reserves being held in the EU. Those two factors, so it is proven to be, at this point in time, the winter is, relatively speaking, mild in New England, and the United States for that matter. I know the West Coast has got a lot of rain, but from a temperature perspective, it is relatively mild. And then the other element, that the reserves, a lot of work that was done by companies and individuals in the EU, and a lot of work that was done to bring more energy in, the reserves were higher. Well, the reserves now are much higher than they were forecasted to be in September. All said and done, bottom line is that the open market position for 2023 is about 27% less expensive than it was forecasted to be in September of 2022. That is massive. And the reason why I say that is massive, while our portfolio, and we think about our portfolio both in terms of kilowatt hours, but also in terms of dollars per kilowatt hours, because at the end of the day, the transactions are all done in dollars, right? That 15% of kilowatt hour forecast in 2023 was almost a third of the total power supply, of the total energy budget. So that little 15% was a third. And the reason being is back in September, the average forward price curve price for 2023 was about $130 a megawatt hour. That number now is down in the range of $80 a megawatt hour, so a pretty significant drop. So I put that in the context of, you know, when we set the budget up and we set the rates up, well, two things. When we look, what we always try to do is we try to look at, when we set rates is, you know, a whole bunch of, you know, we have to cover cost, et cetera, but we also try and look at it is what is the impact in an average customer, right? And there is no average customer, but the average customer in the RMLD territory for a residential customer uses about 800 kilowatt hours a month. And in 2022, the average bill, monthly bill, was about $138 a month. So just a good reference, because as you guys remember, the two key drivers that impact that $138 a month in 2022 was kilowatt hour usage, which varies month to month, and also what our operating cost, our operating rates are, our distribution energy in particular is a key one, and then what power supply is. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, power supply is a pass-through. So we pass through the cost of power supply, and in this particular case, energy or fuel, to the customers at the rate that we paid during that month. Now, there's a couple months lag, and you know, there's a 3-month window in terms of when we do that, and we have a fuel reserve fund that allows us to basically dampen those ups and downs, so we're not jerking the customer up and down. We're not trying to level bill, we're trying to dampen, because the there's a delays built into the system in terms of when the power is used, when we bill for it, and when we pay for it. So all said and done, that pass-through variable, we do our best to forecast what it's going to look like, and when we basically forecast what an average bill would be, we put our best estimate in terms of what we think fuel is going to cost for the next 12 months. So, so what we ended up doing is we went back and we said, okay, what's transpired? So we went and looked at the rate stabilization fund, and we had a discussion about that before. That's still roughly about $6.9 million. As we had discussed, so we looked at it. We had a lot of internal discussions. I left a slide at the very back end. It's still our recommendation that we don't touch that money. The reason that we don't recommend touching that money is there's enough volatility in the market. I won't say in the market. That has a different set of uses, and we might choose to use it at a later point, but I don't think we need to touch it right now. We went and back and looked at depreciation pieces, et cetera, and had a lot of internal discussions on that. That ends up not being relevant for the thing that we're trying to do here, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make sure we have cash, that we bring cash in the form of customer bills, and that we use those to pay all the different expenses. So for all intents and purposes, this is a cash business, and we think about it and run it as a cash business. And that's why you'll see Ben will show a little bit in a few moments where our cash balances are, et cetera. So we're becoming much more diligent in terms of managing our portfolio. I wouldn't say our portfolio, our cash, various cash accounts, both what comes in and what goes out. So back to the rates. Without getting into I mean, I can go as deep as you guys want to, because I think it's fascinating stuff, but I don't want to bore the people. So all said and done, we looked at we looked at the net decrease in terms of what we expect the customers to actually end up paying, and we tried not to go to the very bottom. So we basically, to the best of our ability, we forecasted that the fuel would be approximately 10% less in 2023 than it will in 2024. So that's kind of the bottom line. If you look at purely the forward price curve, that number is probably closer to 16 to 17% lower, but we didn't think it was prudent to forecast all of that drop in the portfolio, given the fact that while things look fairly stable from an energy perspective for the next 12 months, we also don't want to inappropriately set customer expectations too low. So we basically took 10% out of fuel, and when we take 10% out of fuel, now you can go to slide 7, I think is probably the easiest way to do it. Okay. So, in the back of your book, there's each individual account, but if we were to look at the percent change between 2022, which is what customers ended up paying, there's that 138, and what we anticipate a customer will pay in 2023, again, on average over the course of the year, it'd be about $151. That represents about a $13 per month increase. Again, and as we talked about before, $13 a month for some people might not sound like enough, but a lot. But the reality is, it's not trivial numbers for everybody. We realize that any increase, we need to be very careful in terms of thinking through those. We went through the same analysis. Well, we went through the same analysis with all of the different rates, but these are the core ones: the 2 residentials, the commercial, the industrial, and the school. And George, you and I have had discussions when I gave you the 15% numbers for your budget perspective. I don't expect those to actually materialize in 2023, and we'll go back and look at 2024. So that's from an actual perspective. So that's, and I looked to George because all the different towns have requested, what's the forecast in terms of the energy cost, and they're obviously on a July to June timeframe. But anyways. So big picture, I can walk in a lot more detail, but big picture, what we ended up doing is going back and using January forward price curves to put into our best estimate of fuel. We compared that to what we had originally had, back to your question, how did we get started? We got started with September 2022 numbers, which in hindsight was a peak. And so net, we feel comfortable basically proposing, we didn't make changes to the other rate schedules, we left them exactly as they were when we presented back in December. But we anticipate that an average monthly bill from a customer will increase about 9% between what they paid in 2022 and what we expect them to pay in 2023. Two other comments. If you look, and again, people look at rates differently on that. If you go back just one slide. We didn't really,
Greg?
No, I'll let him finish.
so just a couple points and then we'll come back. One caveat, right? As I mentioned before, fuel is a pass-through, right? So if it goes wild again, we could be back up into the 14% range. But we're already, we're actually preparing to bill for February. We're starting, we've already billed January, we're getting ready for February. Oh, by the way, what I mentioned to you back in December, but I'll reinforce again for the external audience, is typically January is one of the higher months of kilowatt hours. So, and it falls off fairly quickly when you get into March and April in terms of kilowatt hours. So we basically set it up such that we would start the increase in March, not in January, so that customers aren't hit with both a higher usage in January and also a rate increase. So the other element is, if you think about it, we've got January and February are going to be at 2022 rates for all intents and purposes, and then we'll have the rate increase apply in March. So March will still come. Every house is different, but March will still come down a bit. But it won't look like a big shock in January. That's one other point. If you want to think about an upper end, again, none of us have a crystal ball, but and as you'll see in the power supply slide deck, energy is a volatile market. I mean, it just is volatile. The good news is that we're very well hedged, or we're very well contracted. So even if things go crazy from $80 back up to $135 or whatever, instead of being a 9%, it'll be 14%, but that will be, and then we don't expect any of that to typically happen until the end of the year at the earliest. Again, we can't forecast everything, but energy prices tend to be lowest on a per unit basis in the spring and the fall, and then relatively speaking, low in the summertime, particularly relative to the winter. So the winter are the highest pressure months from a rate perspective, but the usage is highest in July and August. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Let's go back to slide 7. The last thing that I wanted to mention is on the right-hand side, those two right-hand columns. And just to kind of put things in perspective, those rates are net rates. So if you're basically to take what's my total bill and divide it by my kilowatt hour usage for each class, those two right-hand columns, the current 2022, which is the second to the right column from the right side, and then the proposed March 2023. As you guys can see, whether it's school or industrial or the residentials, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about between residential A and residential time of use. Residential time of use, as you'll see, and there's a letter that, just depending upon what you guys decide to do tonight, but if we approve these rates, that we'll end up putting a letter from the GM on the website. One of the things that will encourage people to do is to look at potentially converting to time of use. Even if you convert to time of use, the intention is to change behavior. But even if you don't change behavior, there's still some potential savings in terms of moving to residential time of use. There's a whole discussion there. But anyways, if you look at all of these numbers, they're still, in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour, they're still very good rates. We did do some more significant increases to the industrial time of use. We didn't have a chance to talk about that before. But there's a lot of load coming into particularly Wilmington that requires some significant increases. Hamid and his team are working on, besides the substation, we're doing work there, but we look at that load as materializing for real. So we've moved, again, it's 9%. That 12 and 13, well, the 13.3% for the industrial time of use is still a very, very good rate. They're all very good rates. But relative to the new customers that are coming to our territory, as we've talked many times, part of the reason that they're interested is the openness of the town of Wilmington, but also the fact that the electricity rates are very, very competitive from an industrial perspective. So I can walk in a little more detail. I'll pause for questions. Yeah, go ahead, Vivek.
So Greg, one of the things you did was, when we got into the discussion, you were thinking about the cash situation. Here, we're talking about rates and how it impacts different class of customers.
Yes.
So we went from 9% to 14%, and now back to, from 10 to 9.
We were a
10 to
little over
14,
10,
yeah.
10 and a half,
Yeah, yeah.
up to 14.3, and
And
now we're
we're
at 9.
now 9%. So I guess your cost may be a little lower, your energy cost may be a little lower, but what does that do to the cash situation?
That $3 million that we were looking to raise when we went from 10.5 to 14.3 is still there. And we still want to keep it there. That's the prudent piece. So we still expect to be in the range of just under $4 million net income for 2023, as opposed to what we had original budget, which was 984, 983.
Okay, thank you.
So we still want to put that in place because that sets us up nicely for 2024 as well. And the intention there was to avoid having to go out and bond. We'll talk about a lot of grant stuff that we're going to get into here in a few minutes when Ben walks through it, so we're being very active. But even if we don't do that, what we're trying to do is basically set the stage for a relatively speaking smooth 2024 without having to do any external funds. And right now we have no debt. That's a whole nother discussion, but that's where we are right now, and I think that's prudent given the projects that we want to present to you guys over the next several months. Other questions? And this is,
I have a quick comment.
Yeah, go
So at the Board of Commissioners meeting, when we originally talked about getting, I think it was Bob that said, we gotta be below 10, and was talking about the rate stabilization fund. So it's all energy costs that
All
really
energy.
drove it down
yeah.
and allowed you to get below 9, because I know you didn't think it was gonna be able to.
I didn't think, but again, at that point, I didn't go back and look at the, again, at the request, we said, okay, go look, see what's going,
Yeah.
be creative. And that, I wouldn't call this being creative, this is saying, hey, where is the energy market? And so the energy market's coming down, and it had come down pretty significantly. We watch it every day, but it was, 27% is dramatic.
Yeah.
That's dramatic. The other key question, of course, Dennis, is, what do you think is going to happen in 2023, and what do you think is going to happen in 2024? The forward price curve, we don't drive the forward price curve. Those are commodity traders that basically say, what do we think is going to happen? And so we look at those numbers, every week, we look at those numbers. But given how things, given specifically that the reserves of energy, particularly oil and natural gas in Europe, are relatively speaking higher than expected, and that this winter is forecasted to be mild, and a lot of the other creative things that the Europeans are doing to try and unplug themselves as much as possible from Russia oil and Russia natural gas. I won't say it's stable, but it's not dire. I wouldn't say dire. Well, depends upon what country you're in. It's not as dire as it was back in the summer of 2022, which it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and the other thing is, in the CAB meeting, I'd mentioned, we are saying start in March, but it's really, people are used to paying a high bill in January, February, and it's the illusion of, okay, I went down, but they're not gonna realize they didn't go down as much because
Correct.
it's kind of blending right through
Yep.
as a drop, and they may not notice the increase as much because of that.
And that was intentional. I mean, that's part of the reason why we actually moved it to March,
Yeah.
right? Now, we're still, we work, so RMLD works on a 12-month, calendar year, so January to December. So, we are in good cash position in January, February. By moving that out, it wasn't the end of the world. Obviously, it moved the rates up a little bit higher, but we thought it was prudent from a customer perspective not to push so high in January, February. And it's proven, well, I think as people see their January bills and they see their, particularly when they go to cocktail parties and say, hey, I'm in an IOU territory. And again, I'm not throwing stones at IOUs at all. We have a different cost structure, but I will share with you, I will share with you one other data point that we did in the analysis, and that is the IOUs tend to structure their bills into a supply component and a distribution component. And the distribution component is all what we call our operating cost. And so the current status for grid in NEMA, in our territory up here, is it's just over 25 cents a kilowatt hour. Our equivalent is just under 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So while we have advantages relative to our power supply, we also, because of our scale and the ability for us to, we've got flexibility in terms of being able to do things a little bit differently. Again, it's different businesses, but, those are good numbers in terms of how we run this place. We do run it, relatively speaking, lean. Now, so that's just another data point. But your point is very well taken, that we purposely decided not to implement it January 1st, but to wait till March, for that reason. Yeah, go ahead.
And for the various rates, did the increase in the distribution charges stay the same as your earlier?
Yeah, the only change, I didn't change, I looked at them, but we didn't make any changes to any of
The other
components.
yeah.
We only looked at fuel.
Okay.
And that'll give you an impact, because it's such a big portion of the overall cost structure. Again, it's a 3-to-1 ratio, basically, right? Our operating costs are 1/3, power supply is 2/3. And fuel, the reason why fuel was so significant is that the open market price was so much larger, like 3 times as large. We're in the low 40s for our contracted position, and this was at 133. That little 14%, 15% had a big dollar value.
Yeah.
And when that dropped, so that 27%, it worked out to be in excess of $6.5 million in our budget, right? And our overall, the original budget was $74 million for power supply. So we'll probably, it is highly likely, given what we know, that we'll be in the high 60s.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question, but only if the rate questions are, I want you guys to ask your questions.
I got just a couple more on rate,
Yeah.
Unless you have one.
No, mine's about rate stabilization fund, so after the rate
yeah.
questions.
I guess a couple points, Greg.
Yep.
I still hear we're being conservative, right? Even though projected energy costs are trending downwards for 2023. That seems to be the trend, pretty news all over the place, right?
Yes, sir.
We're still being conservative.
Yes.
And
In
then
terms
also-
of the numbers that we presented, but keep going. Yep.
We're also being profitable.
Correct.
So conservative and profitable at the same time, and we're still asking for, I would say, significant rate increases for a what if,
For
right?
what?
For a possibility or a what if, right?
Yeah.
You know, if you're looking at a $4 million profit, okay, you know, is it acceptable to take a $2 million profit and ride out we're in a good spot. So do we really need to be conservative, number one, and then also be as profitable as we quote, quote, need to be? You know, yeah, we can make money, but do we have to make that much money? That sounds like communism right there. Sorry, capitalism 101. But, you know, we're not-for-profit, right? You know, we're here to do the best for the ratepayers. So between those two numbers, you know, if you did $2 million off the top, say, okay, I'll be half as profitable, and I'd be half as conservative, you're probably looking at $3.5 million, somewhere in that range. That's another significant drop. I mean, I just kind of ballparking some stuff. Those are significant numbers on that. And again, not touching the rate stabilization, which is what we talked about last time. You know, you might be looking at another 2% drop potentially in some of these numbers, right?
Well, so I think a couple numbers to look at. So if I go back to the budget, right, the 2023 budget from from the income statement perspective, the original proposal was $958,000, which is 3.13 return, rate of return, right? Again, we're not for profit. I got that,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, no.
Because that, at the end of the day, this money stays within RMLD and it goes to pay for, I mean, it's all rate, no matter how you slice it, it's all ratepayer money.
Yep.
Our target, the target historically has been in the 5 to 6% range. So we, because we are trying to be conservative, back to your original point, wanted to make sure that we could operate and do the builds out we need to do and pay the expenses that we knew were coming in. We tried to make that lean to start with. So when I say it's conservative, the conservative part is, I think that that our average customer bill will be less than 9%, because the fuel costs will be probably another $2 million less. I think that's the place to play it, and not, like, we want to get back up to where, to the 5 to 6% rate, because that gives us the flexibility to continue to build out the network for the load growth that we now know is coming, right? It's not,
Yeah.
you know, we're in a very different mode than we were 5 years ago or 4 years ago, where, hey, you know, rates, not rates, but load is flat to maybe dropping. And so you think about it a little bit differently. Here, we actually have to continue to invest in the business. The original budget in 2024 had us also at 3.2% or $1.3 million, but it also assumed that we'd have to raise $12 million on top of that. So the reason why we want to keep all the other components where they were, to keep that $3 million, that incremental $3 million in play, is to allow us to be better set up for 2024. At the end of the day, the customers are going to pay the cost either now or later. Again, you know, back to my 8 cents, you know, per kilowatt hour versus 25 cents per kilowatt hour. We run a very lean operation. We run it well. So you know, while I hear the question, the strong recommendation is not to reduce it any further, to let that 9% stay, let the other rates stay. The reality is, you know, there's probably downside, there could be upside, but that you know, back to the original request, that sub 10%, while, and again, that sub 10% is, you know, the 9%, it's $13 a month. And I'm not saying that's a trivial number, but in terms of being prudent to run a business that is in growth mode, I would not recommend making additional changes to the rates to make them any lower, to try and get that number down to 8% or 7.4% or whatever. That $2 or $1 a month on an average customer basis is money that we will probably still need in 2024. So we are doing a little bit of preparing for the future. We're also trying to get ourselves to be back up into a more prudent base. When we put the budget together back in early October, even us looking at the numbers, it was a very different world than it is now. So while I hear the question, I don't recommend making additional changes in the downward direction. I hear the question very clearly, but from a business perspective, I wouldn't recommend that.
Just one more point, if I may. And I don't know if it's nitpicky, but flat rate changes, not 9.3, 9. You know, I know.
Oh, say that again?
I would just, if we're gonna raise a rate, we mentioned 9, that's 9.3. If it's 6.8, you know, I think whole numbers are good numbers, because when you talk about something, and I get it's math, you know, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I just, that was my change. If you're gonna say it's a 9% change, it's a 9%,
Well,
roughly, you know.
Yeah, well, so the way, and a good point. I think the way we look at that is, you know, each of the different, so we're probably, as you look at each of the different components, there's a lot of analysis behind it to look at all the different components, and obviously we need to make sure that it's consistent across different rate classes. There's a bunch of things we need to do from a compliance perspective. So when we're doing those numbers, you know, we might be, you know, a full point or a half a point when we do those numbers, but the numbers that we present here, the 9.3, for example, you know, that's a forecast of what a customer bill would look like relative to what he paid last year. So we're not,
Okay.
we're not trying to narrow
no,
it.
I get it.
It's not like it's not like we take one number and we make an adjustment to that one number and it's 9% and it flows all the way through. You know, there are 7 key numbers for each rate class that we need to make adjustments, and those we do in either whole increments or tenths, you know, half a percent increments. But anyway, at the end of the day, that 9.3 is how it plays out. On the aggregate, it actually worked out to be 8.9, but we just, for simplicity, rounded up to 9%, because it's just simpler, as opposed to 8.9. Back to your point. So, kind of like. Other questions? Yeah.
I have one more. So you went from the 14 to the 9, but that was basically being fortunate that the energy costs dropped.
Correct.
So you didn't have to do rate stabilization. You didn't have to get creative another way to get the rate down. So coming to this meeting where it's a benefit to be at 9, but like Bob's saying, and I understand what you're saying about having building for the future, but the goal was to find ways to cut costs and or lower that increase, and all that happened was the energy rate went down, so it happened as, you know.
Well,
Attrition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, yeah, are we fortunate, or are our customers fortunate? Yeah. But I think the other thing, Dennis, is when we actually put the original budget together, there's not, you know, we didn't create a very rich budget, right? Because that's why we ended up at 3.13%, and we had, you know, $958,000, because we didn't feel like, you know, we cut everywhere we could to still make it profitable and try and keep ourselves around 10%. Again, we're trying to run this business, again, it's not a for-profit business, right? This is all ratepayer money, and the question is just how you move, you know, how you manage it in the different buckets. So while I hear the request, we actually did go back and look at it. But as we looked at the different budget items, there were no significant places where we could say we need to undo stuff. And part of the driver behind that is we, more so now than we knew back in September, this load that's coming in is for real. And the load that's coming in requires investment.
So you feel that if the energy rate didn't drop, you would have come into tonight saying the
I would have
rate's
come in.
14%?
I would have come in tonight and said we should stay at 14%. I would have absolutely said
That is what they're
that.
doing, because they didn't change any number that
That's what I'm
isn't
saying, yeah.
affected by, it's a forecasted number and it's a pass-through. Fuel's a pass-through.
It's a pass-through.
So the only thing that's changing is the current forecast of a pass-through. So this could have been 9% back in December, they just didn't know.
Yeah.
It could be still 14, it could be
Yeah.
20, it could be 5, if fuel,
Yeah.
depending on what fuel does. So there was no changes
Yeah.
to any of the increases in the part of the bill that actually go to fund their budget.
Correct.
So the distribution energy charge went up 25%, it's still up 25% as it was
Correct.
in December.
Yeah.
The customer charge went up 15% in December, it's still 15% up today.
No change.
So if you go through, every number is exactly the same on anything that Reading controls. The only thing that's different is the forecast of a pass-through.
Correct.
So
So-
this is a little bit of a messaging issue, because it's a question of what is the charge, what is the rate increase in 2023, and you're trying to reduce the impact that you could possibly have in 2024, right? Because you're saying you need 12 million effectively. Like you're saying, I need 12 million extra cash, I'm gonna generate 4 million of it today.
3.
And then if I need all of that in 2024, if I keep the rate at a 5% increase instead of 9%, then I'm transferring that that possibly into next year. So I'm trying to reduce the shock in the future. So I think if you include that in the messaging, that could be helpful.
That's fair.
Right. And
Yeah,
I do
and I-
think it's a function of the volatility.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're wrestling with here is just the volatility of the market.
Yeah.
I mean, what we've seen. And there's nothing that says next month, there could be another invasion of the Ukraine by other people, and all of a sudden, everything blows up. Europe gets involved in it, and we'll see the energy prices skyrocket. So I think it's good to be somewhat conservative here.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I didn't mention, and so Dennis, I do hear you, yeah, and if I couldn't find anything else, I would have come back and I would have come back and recommended the 14 that I did back in December.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly feel from managing the
And we'll be
business.
talking rate stabilization then.
Well, then,
if
and then,
anything.
and then we could say, do we take $1 million or $1.5 million out of rate stabilization, which I also don't think is prudent, but, in terms of, again, trying to take, the balance is, we're trying to take care of the customer no matter how we do it. And now the mechanism is how we do it. Because again, we're in a very, for all the reasons that we mentioned, we're in a very different world right now. The other piece that comes into the equation, going back to Jason, your comment, is I don't want to reduce any of the numbers because there is a chance that we might end up to being into some sort of a recession or some slight recession, which means the kilowatt hours could potentially reduce. And if that reduces, then that basically brings less dollars in. So we've got to manage this very carefully in the context of what's happening. Now, this is 2023. 2024, most people think that if there is going to be a recession in 2023, it'll be out in 2024, so things look quote-unquote rosier in 2024. So there are a bunch of variables that we manage from a business perspective, and kilowatt-hour sales is one of them. And while we don't have total control of it, this is part of the reason why we are very aggressive in terms of doing whatever we can to encourage new customer and new load to come into our territory. And low rates is one mechanism, but also, as we talked about before, trying to be nimble and being responsive and trying to be creative in terms of how we make it easy for customers to come into our territory. And that's what we're doing on Upton Road, that's what we're doing on Lowell Street, and that's what we're doing on Fordham Road. So we're trying to make it easy for customers to come in. Now, they still have to write checks, right? We are a municipal utility, and if there's something that's specific to an individual customer, they write the check, right? And so we continue to do that. But yeah, so at the end of the day, exactly right. I think, Vivek, the way you position it is correct, that we've talked about before. This isn't just a one-year snapshot. We'd look at the nature of the business. That's why we have a 6-year plan. And so we're looking 6 years out. But 2023 is a quirky year, right? And we need to do things now. And the good news is, the market looks good, and it is all passed through. You're exactly right, Jason.
And just as a point of reference too, the South Linfield residents that are customers of Peabody Light have
Yes,
been
sir.
advised they're going to see a 16% rate increase next year, or this year.
This year, yeah, which I think is already in place as of January. Exactly right. That's irrelevant. Yeah, relative to other MLPs, we're on the low end as well. Right. And again, we're managing, we're different. We've got scale, so we can do things a little bit differently, and we've got a very good power supply portfolio. We really do. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Other questions? Yes.
I saw a slide that said rate stabilization fund, and we mentioned it a couple of times, that we're not going to be talking about it, but,
We can talk about it.
well, that's what, I still, could you review the
Yeah.
history of it? I'm looking at you, Phil.
Oh, the history of it.
And the future of it, and maybe Ben has some opinions on the future of the rate stabilization fund, because it sounds like a fund that's old, untapped, and on a shelf, waiting for someday we might use it. I don't know.
Do you want to go to slide 16?
But tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah. So, it was so back in 2003, and Phil could add, it was created and the target was set at $6.5 million back in 2003. That was a recommendation from the management at the time, both the CAB and the Board of Commissioners voted on it. Based on the notes, the intention was to use it in unusual circumstances where there would be significant rate shock for the customers. Now, back then, power supply was driven primarily off of oil. There was more nuclear at the time, but there was a broader set of firm, when I say firm, steady, reliable output of energy. What we have done in the past 20 years, and most recently in the context of the 2021 climate bill to decarbonize, is we're moving more quickly toward a larger portfolio of intermittent resources. And you'll see in a few minutes, I'll talk about how we balance the risk associated with that. But where I would anticipate us using this fund is that if one of our larger solar arrays that we have a contract with, or one of the larger turbines falls, or somebody decides to do damage to one of the hydro facilities where we have 5 or 6 or 8 or 10% of our portfolio in one particular asset, and that asset goes offline for an unusual reason, not the fact that it's sunny or not sunny a particular day, and it's offline for whatever, 2 months, 12 months, some number like that, that's where I would anticipate us using the rate stabilization fund. In fact, at a later time, what we were discussing internally, but maybe what we start thinking about, and 2023 is not the time to do it, maybe not 2024, but we move that up to be around 10% of our forecasted power supply cost. And so at 74, that'd be 7.4 million. So at some point, we're actually suggesting that we actually move that up to 7.5 million, but not right now. So I don't know, Phil, any additional comments in terms of the purpose behind it or the history?
6.5 was a recommendation from the CAB.
Okay.
That was a CAB recommendation back in those days.
Yep.
I don't know who remembers Fred Van Magnus, who's still around. He was the champion of that. And basically, the idea with the rate stabilization fund was so there wasn't, to try to keep the rates level. So there wouldn't be a big spike one year. The rate stabilization fund was that's what its purpose called, to stabilize the rates at this point. I don't think in the old days, so it's like, we had him in the system. We ever thought, that we'd be held for emergencies, but I guess that seems to be what you're now doing for it at this point.
But Greg, when we've used it in the last few years, right?
So
We've used the rate stabilization fund. When was it last used?
So
When
we
could
used
you
it
talk
about
about
a year and a half ago.
Yes.
And part of the reason why we used it a year and a half ago is that it had grown to almost $8.8 million. And the target was 6.5. So we basically took $1.6 million out of it to bring us back into the mid $6 million range. So that's what we ended up doing, and we did it over the course of 4 months, $400,000, and it applies to fuel, same place. But that's when we used it last. Now, it also had tied to a commitment that was made several years back that rates wouldn't increase more than 3.2% for the municipalities for their budget purposes, and so we squeaked through and made it work, and I think that was the end of last year, actually, when we finally did that final piece of it, the end of spring of 2022. So yes, we did use it recently, Vivek, but the motivation of the previous leadership was to get us back down into the mid $6 million range. That was the driver, more than anything. Yeah.
So the goal is 6.5. I understand down the future you may want to have that number. You're at 6.9. Could you take the 400,000 and bring it down to 6.5 and apply that to the residential rates instead of, just the residential rates instead of everybody to lower that number? Like,
I have to, no, because the fund, so I could take we could certainly do that. It's not gonna move the needle, but we could certainly do that. But we'd have, since the fund came from an aggregate of ratepayers, I couldn't apply it back to an individual group of
That's go
ratepayers.
across the board.
Yeah, so I have to go across the board. But yeah, I mean, we
I
could
mean,
do
we were
it.
talking 1.6 million, I think, at the Board of Commissioners meeting.
Yeah.
Right, so you can't, the rate's going down because of energy costs. $400,000 towards what we were talking about isn't.
For right now, if that's the request, I mean, I don't recommend us taking money out of it, but to go down $400,000, if that's the suggestion of the commissioners, I mean.
It would I think at that point, it might cost more to do that than it would to
Yeah.
get that.
Right.
It would probably have to be a $1.5 million, it would have
In order
to
to
be
make it-
significant.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't move the needle at the end of it. Nobody would even notice it. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not why you wouldn't do it, but it wouldn't be material. they
Someone's
wouldn't
bill's
even,
not gonna
I mean,
change enough to notice
it'd be nice from a PR perspective, but it doesn't, it's already a good story. Other thoughts, other questions?
If, you just mentioned, if something big happens on one of our power supplies, it just begs, I guess, the question about insurance, right?
Yeah, you mentioned that before, yeah.
Well, so if we, I don't know what's in place for an insurance, obviously we have cash to offset, but then I'm sure there's some type of insurance policy on these things that you would ultimately get your money back. It might take time, but you're basically looking for a cash. But we have cash in the other funds to pick up the cost of purchasing energy. I mean, again, to Phil's point, it's a rate stabilization fund. If we think we're gonna, we went up a couple percent, now we're jumping to 9%. And if next year we think we're gonna have another increase, again, we don't know what to project.
Yeah.
Do we start thinking about, again, using it for its true, for that, I'm gonna say true purpose, but for that purpose of, again, dropping the rates down.
Yeah.
Personally, I'd rather see, a lower percentage increase this, per year, and use cash that's available, and you're not exposing Reading Light, because potentially in 2 years, we could be making money and putting money back into this.
Well,
That's a possibility.
I think that's the good point. And part of so the way the rate stabilization fund is currently structured, you have to make specific transfers into it, and then it earns interest. And we took the action item to look at, so we're going to look in terms of how we can generate a little more interest on that rate stabilization fund. That's a whole nother topic. But the idea of doing some sort of insurance and power supply, we haven't had a chance to look at that, but we will definitely look at that. But there might be an opportunity for us to restructure the rate stabilization fund, and that, in order to dampen it, we actually, as opposed to doing specific transfers into it, we basically make some number, and I haven't run through the analysis, but some number where we're always putting dollars into it, and then we're also actively bringing dollars out of it, right? And that's what we do with the fuel. There's a deferred fuel fund, right, which is a $2.5 million piece, and we do that to dampen, to reduce the volatility on the fuel piece of it. But we could look at some point, I mean, I say this, we could look at recasting the rate stabilization fund in the context of a very different world than it was back, 20 years ago, to think about it a little bit differently and use it more to dampen the ups and downs, right? Because there is in the context of all this discussion, there is one thing that we're looking at. We do have a budget program for customers who want to basically be level billed, and there's only about 100 customers on it, and we haven't promoted it very much. We're in the middle of doing an update to bring our Cogsdale billing system up to date, current revision that is, and they have a little bit more sophisticated forecasting tools in terms of making that level loaded. So we are probably going to encourage customers to do level billing. Just make it available to them. They can do whatever they want, but just make it, because we don't promote it very well. But we might actually look at taking rate stabilization and recast it in the context of intermittent resources. I think that's a great idea. And then the other element is, look at, really see if we can do some sort of insurance on the intermittent resources, pardon me. As we talked about before, the nuclear structures, those are all firm. So if for some reason those go down, then the vendor is required to replace that energy. The intermittents don't have that firm. When I say firm, if it's not, we basically buy what they produce. And obviously, as we all know, our intention, the first part of our charter is reliable. So when customers want electricity, we want to be there to provide it. And then low cost, and then non-carbon in that order. So I'll do the takeaways of rethinking, and it won't be till realistically the end of the year, or the last half of the year to think, restructure, and we'll work, Ben and I will work and with the IRD team in terms of thinking about how to rethink that piece and take the insurance piece. I think those are great suggestions. But Dennis, back to you. I think we leave, if we're going to make a move on rate stabilization, it should be a big chunk that's meaningful. I think is kind of the recommendation I put back to the commissioners and the Citizens Advisory Board. Other questions?
Average annual interest is pretty low. I assume you have an opportunity to increase it now with rates in general going up?
Yeah, I think there's additional opportunity, well, there are definitely additional opportunities. One of the things that I need to look at is the structure with the town in terms of who gets that
Who will hold
interest.
that money? Okay.
Yes, so, I think in this particular case, anyways, there's more work to be done there. But, yeah.
It just stood out as a very
But at
low
the end of the
number.
day, it should be earning more interest
Yeah.
in the future. So, I mean, however we make those mechanisms work out, yeah, it's.
We sort of talked a little bit about that, I think, previously in terms
Yeah.
of the financial instrument that is most likely is a bond ladder. And bonds are now paying somewhere between 4.5 treasury bonds. So there's nowhere in default, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe, we won't get to that.
Yeah, way to come-
4.5 to
way to come
4.7. So a bond ladder does exactly that. It gives you the capital when you decide you need the capital. You can lay it out in the future. It's totally predictable. And so I think it really fits exactly and very reliable, so.
Good.
We have George Santos on the Science Committee, so I think I have a quick question. Looking ahead, as we're debating rate increases, but that are across the board and on rates that are largely flat across the day, meaning people are still paying the same, so it's the same general model for what rates are. And we've had a lot of conversations about how can we move to broad-based, time-based rates so that people are, a lot of more people than now are paying what it's actually costing us, and that will have so many benefits when we can get there. So what are your thoughts on how that?
Well, so
rolls out?
two thoughts. One is, I didn't have it all put together for today's presentation, but the three-tier time of use. So there's a commitment from us to move more aggressively toward time of use across all rate categories. As an intermediate step, we're going to look. No, we're almost finished putting together that A3 EV1, whatever we want to call it, and not have it limited only to EVs. Again, part of the goal there was to basically, as we have new load come in, encourage the new load to be in a portion of our load curve where it is low. And kind of back to your point, Commissioner, is in the middle of the night. So one of the things that Hamid and I have been talking about is, what can we do on the rate side, which actually helps optimize the use of our distribution network, and that is what we call a unity load curve. So whatever the time of the day is, it's basically flat. Now that's not possible, but I agree, it's not possible, but to move the midnight, so we don't have a very big dip in the middle of the night because of our industrial load. We go down to 52, 53 megawatts. But to move that up into the 70 megawatt range will be a good thing. So that's one piece. But the other thing, which kind of talks back to the other request that you have pushed on a few times, and that is peak management, right? So one of the things that we're going to introduce to you guys, not tonight, but is a coincident peak program. So a different way to do our peak management, to make it easier for the industrials, commercials, and potentially customers to participate, but also make the administration a little bit easier. Because right now, our peak management program, it's not very successful. And so we're gonna play around with a coincident peak. And what that coincident peak means basically is that our customers' demand charges will be linked to when RMLD's demand charges. Now, so some work to all make that, but that basically links us directly, so there's a one-to-one relationship. And that should hopefully, there have been other utilities that have used that coincident peak successfully. So that's coming down the road, to answer that question.
And those are all good things. There are also things that people will have the option to sign on to, or not to sign on to.
We can discuss that piece too, yeah.
I mean, but still, the model for the utility is that people pay a flat rate, no matter whether they're cranking the AC at 4 p.m. on a 100-degree day,
It's the current model.
Sorry, it is the current model.
It's
So
the current
the
model.
things that you answered just now don't move towards a broad-based, time-based
Well, I think-
rate that everybody at some level shoulders a little bit and feels it a little bit
Yeah.
in that peak. Then that will change behavior.
Yeah.
When there's a little bit of a signal for everybody.
So I'm not saying, and I'm actually in agreement with you that we want to move toward more universal time of use. One of the things that we're finishing off right now is the RFP for our MDM system and AMI system, which will allow us to do that as well. So our intention as a utility is to move toward more time of use rates across the board. Question is just how fast can we get that done? And part of it is limited in terms of our current AMI network, but there's still upside. So we're gonna be aggressive in terms of moving toward that. My other two examples were intermediate steps, not a wholesale move to everybody being time of use. The other point, as I mentioned earlier, is that even with the existing structure we have right now, the default for the residential, for example, is a flat rate. But if people move to a time of use rate, their savings could be nearly 10%, even if they didn't do any behavior change. Now, that begs the question, well, that's not the point. The point is you want to change behavior.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So we're going to look at that time of use piece as well.
Just a quick related question about the technology. So do we or do we not have meters that today could be programmed to put a little surcharge for those peak times? That the meters are able to give you that data and enable you to bill that way
Yeah,
now?
we do. So part of our network,
No, yes.
yeah, part of our network is about 10% of our meters. We have 30,000 meters. Actually we're structured to be time of use related to do the kind of things you want to do.
But the other 90% can't do that?
Correct.
They can't be programmed?
Well, we haven't dug all the way into it in terms of what they can, but currently they're not configured to do, they're not able to do that. When we put the MDM system in place, we can basically look at those other 90% as being dumb meters and do all of the analysis on the MDM system. And that's part of the reason why we're trying to get the MDM system in this year. So it's not all figured out, but that's part of the intention as an intermediate step.
Because a lot of this isn't sinking in for the broad base of the.
Well, we haven't
rate
pushed it
payer.
either yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
People don't get it after, I've been on the board almost 10 years, and the average person doesn't understand that it costs more for us at 4 PM on a hot day as it does at 3 AM. Nobody gets that.
The average person doesn't pay attention.
Right, they don't, and they don't have to because the rate is the same 24 hours a day. They don't have to think about it, and then,
Well,
when are we gonna change it?
Yeah,
Somehow get their attention.
But you're also a victim of life.
Sure.
Right? You get up at 7 and you come home at 4.
Sure.
You should not be punished
No,
for that activity.
Coming home at 4.
Because that's your life is based around daylight structure, right? So, it's good, but it's also bad because it's how you survive during the day, right?
I want
You
to
just-
punish people for their life. That's what I'm trying to do. It's just to be clear. No, I'm kidding aside. It's like, yes, that's true, and we don't want to make it hard on people.
Yeah,
But there's a little bit of
But
something we can do.
I think the other piece, though, what's different now going forward as opposed to 10 years ago,
Yep.
is that there is upward pressure on the cost of energy, right? And that's what we're talking about tonight. And that upward pressure is going to continue. And so for different people, that threshold of, hey, I don't care about the bill, just put it on auto pay, whatever, to, hey, it's kind of big this month, what should I be doing differently? I don't think we're there yet, but I think the other piece that's going to change besides a lot more communication and promotion and education, in fact, going on right now, there is one of our quarterly webinars. Anyway, they happen to schedule it at the same night, but it's talking about basically home energy audits and weatherization. So that's literally happening right now. So that's one of the mechanisms that we find effective in terms of communicating. There's probably 200 people on that Zoom call, literally, as we talk right now. But I think your bigger point, Commissioner, is as these numbers get bigger, and again, our numbers aren't significant as they are in other territories, but people are going to start paying attention to it because it's not an irrelevant number in their big budget, and it's becoming more relevant. And on top of that, as the drive toward electrification, which is EVs and air source heat pumps replacing fossil fuel, that too is going to drive this number up more significantly, and people are going to pay more attention. So that's coming. So I think there's natural pieces that are set up, but I think what you're saying is, hey, let's get going here to set it up so that it's easy for customers to know what's going on and make changes.
I agree with you. I think this number, though, compared to my oil bill, is nothing. My oil bill is like huge, right? All our oil bills are that way. So moving to a heat pump would be fabulous. And of course, if everybody did that tomorrow, and it really works, it's amazing. I've got one in my house, and it really works beautifully.
Yeah.
So I could take advantage of all these low rates that RMLD has.
Yeah.
But that's going to cause surges if everybody goes to a heat pump, right? So
Yeah,
back
well-
to your argument about the need for infrastructure to be able to support
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, I mean, so we do have a plan and a map in terms of how we're trying to make all this happen. We still put it together, but we're not shooting from the hip. We aren't.
So Greg, I want to come back to the rate stabilization fund.
Yes, sir.
Because what would, you said 400K is not material.
I'm saying,
No, no.
it wouldn't move the needle.
Yeah.
I'm not saying, it's real money.
So what would move the needle? Because because there was the discussion about the insurance play, right? Because what you're trying to do is, you're trying to use the rate stabilization fund to do other than rate stabilization. You're trying to use that money to be a hedge for an energy-
Catastrophic.
For energy
Significant.
shock.
Yeah.
And so, Bob was saying, is there an insurance play you could do to hedge against that?
So order of magnitude, so if we were to take $1.5 million out of the rate stabilization fund and apply it to the fuel fund here to reduce what the rates would what a monthly bill would be, it would basically reduce it about 1.2%. So instead of being 9%, we're going to be, 7.75. Not to get too.
8.
It'll be 8. Yeah, so we basically we go 8, and we would basically reduce it, $1.25, $1.35. Instead of being 13, it's gonna be, 10.85.
But Greg, all of this it's messaging. You have a rate stabilization fund. You say, I'm using part of my rate stabilization fund, and I'm preparing for that contingency by using an insurance product. So I'm just saying, if that's possible, it's just a good faith effort. And then it's a material effort, so that.
I make just a comment. I seem to recall from some of our previous discussions that if a substation went down, God forbid, that to bring in the resources to basically take the role of that substation is hugely expensive. I forget what, it was millions of dollars.
Yeah, that's right.
Like a week or something like that. I mean, it was really heavy duty. So I think us being a bit conservative in terms of, we're basically self-insuring.
Correct.
That's what I see this as being. And using that and having that money there in case something does happen, because we certainly wouldn't want the businesses in Wilmington or Reading or, anywhere to be off the grid for any period of time. So I see it as a self-insurance mechanism, and what little additional we could get in terms of putting that money into here so that we could get an extra lower 1%. No one's going to even look at the 1%. No one's going to, they've all been flooded already in the newspapers with, 7% or 8% inflation. I went to buy a can of soup the other day at the supermarket. It was $4.50 for a can of soup. I'm going, whoa, I didn't buy it. But it's impacting everybody. But I think, this is, it's got to be a competitive analysis in terms of if we were in National Grid or we're in Eversource, you'd be paying 2 to 3 times as much for the energy. So I see us as being very fiscally conservative in terms of having this fund for emergency purpose. I view it as an emergency resource, quite frankly, not as it's a rate stabilization. I understand that to eliminate the highs and lows. But I think we need every dollar we can if something does go down until we get we've been trying to get this substation built, over in Wilmington for years now.
Yeah.
And finally, I think we're on the verge of getting it done. But I'm still concerned that somebody will come by and shoot a few of the transformers like we were discussing earlier. And what happens when that happens? I shouldn't even mention that, I'm sorry, but in a public forum.
That becomes an insurance thing, I would think,
Well,
not come out of the
Yeah.
ratepayers.
So there's an
If it was that
economic.
extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but the question is, can there be, rather than being self-insured, can you have an insurance product?
Yeah.
If you're being self-insured, John, I totally agree with you. Okay, the question is, do we want to be self-insured, right? And that's the point that Bob
Right,
was.
you gotta figure it out, but
Yeah.
you make a great point, like, you have it, and again, however you look at it, you have it, use it, I guess, if you, to make would it be appropriate to make a motion to use it? And would that stop?
I think of it as a catastrophe fund, not rate stabilization fund. I think the name
That's how
is
we're treating
misleading.
it, yeah.
That's exactly right. You're right, Dennis.
But there are other cash reserves besides this.
Yeah, there are cash reserves.
You're right.
And Phil.
So you can't say it's just, we're
No,
trying to
it's large,
set up
no.
a specific fund for it.
No, and Phil, the way this was set up, right, you said this was set up by the cab, right?
No, it existed before the cap.
Before the cab, but okay.
The 6.5
Right.
was the recommendation of
Okay.
the level, at that point to be.
Okay, but if we go back to the RMLD policies that basically set this up, what is the language in there? Is the language for rate stabilization?
It's more complicated
Let's
than
go
that.
back to Haven's.
It's more complicated.
We'll
than
give
that,
you all
'cause
the
a
meeting
rate
minutes,
stabilization
Vivek.
fund has very specific meaning and very specific uses in the eyes of the DPU
Okay,
and FERC accounting.
So-
So if
so-
it's
And I think
clearly
that's
set
where
up
those
as a rate
bullet points
stabilization
might
fund,
come
there's
in.
only a certain finite.
yeah, no, so
things you
that's
can
my
use it for.
point. If it's set up, if
The
the
word
policies.
unusual, I
yeah.
don't think was random. I think they plucked the word unusual circumstances from.
Yeah, I read
Something.
that, so how about if I do not recommend us taking money out of the rate stabilization fund at this time. I will take the action item, again, I serve at the pleasure of the Board of Commissioners, and then with the advice of the CAB. I will pursue the opportunity to look at insurance options relative to an alternative, going back to, how do we prevent catastrophic events? Because we're in a very different world than we were 20 years ago. We also have the action item, which we already have, in terms of looking at a different option, what we do with whatever the balance is of the rate stabilization fund. But I professionally and strongly encourage us to approve the rates that we have presented here. I think it's the prudent, appropriate thing, given where we are in 2023. But I will, I serve at the pleasure of the board, so if you want me to take 1.5 million out of it, it's worth about $1.25, it's worth about 1%. We can do that. I will do additional research, though, in terms of how, of what that rate, of what we might want to look at it, using it differently going forward in time. But I don't recommend us taking anything out of it right now. Recommendation.
I would have to agree with the GM. It's not that this particular fund has grown in abundance as it has in previous years, where we've actually turned some of it back to the ratepayers.
Yes, right. Yeah.
This here is exactly where it should be at this point. So I would agree that we'd want to keep this if something was to happen. Yeah.
No, so it's good. I'm fine with that. I just wanted us to have a discussion
Oh,
on this.
discussion, it's helpful, because I've got action items out of this, so that's great.
And the question is, from a CAB point of view, are we comfortable with the motion here, or do we want to have a different motion?
We don't need a motion on this, do we?
No, I mean,
we have the motion.
if you want to change it, then there's a motion.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we are fine. We have a motion on the table.
Motion on the table is to approve the rates as.
As
yes,
is, right.
correct,
As is.
Yeah.
Correct, yes.
As presented now.
As presented. Okay. So I'm just checking that, we're not
Yeah.
changing anything there.
That's,
Okay.
from my perspective, no.
Okay, all right.
You need to take a vote,
You take your vote and then.
Okay, so, all right, so
we
we
got a
have the
motion and
motion. Yeah, it's seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Thank you.
And all those, any other discussion from the commissioners?
discussion on our side.
And we already read and seconded the motion, so all those in favor with, as presented, Marlene Abita,
Aye.
yes.
Coulter.
Stempak.
Thank you.
Erica, would it be easier if I said things like Mr. Coulter, Mr. Stempak, and then you went down? Because I know some other boards do it that way, instead of everyone speaking at once.
That's certain things.
Yeah, you're definitely welcome to do the roll.
No, I'm just asking what's easier for you.
I mean, for me, it doesn't really matter because it's taped and I know you guys, well, I know your voices, so I can get those down. But for clarity, for people watching, we definitely.
It only takes a second to say
Usually
Mr.
minutes
Coulter.
usually list the members who vote, so Eric has listed that.
Right,
Yes, she
no,
does.
she wants to list it.
We had
Okay,
100 we
so the
had
motion
105
passes
members here.
5-0.
Thank you.
So Greg, second question on the states, can we move that to some other fund? Can we move it out of the rate stabilization line and move it to like?
That's one of the things I'm gonna look at in terms of, back to the prompting that Jason said and how we've got to categorize, a little more research on it.
Yeah.
I'll work with Ben and a lot of history.
I'm thinking, as we're sitting here, the public says, well, gee, it's a stabilization fund, and you're raising rates, and why don't you go to the stabilization fund?
I hear you.
I mean,
So
I
I-
had somebody come up to me and said, we should spend the construction fund to lower the rates. The general manager said, I'll need bail money.
That's one of the action items that I've got coming out of this.
Benjamin Blumenthal, Director of Accounting and Finance.
Great. Thank you, Madam Commissioner, through you to the distinguished members of this board. My name is Ben Blumenthal. I'm the Director of Finance and Accounting for RMLD. I started back at the end of October, and tonight I will be presenting a brief snapshot of our financial update for the quarter. Great. This slide here is basically documenting our milestones in the last couple of months. Since joining RMLD, calendar year 2023's budget is now live and active on our systems. We have a new organizational structure here within my group. So essentially what has happened is both purchasing and accounting group has come under one umbrella. Before, it used to be under operations with Director Hamid's group. However, we believe that in order to promote efficiency and synergy between the two groups, we felt that by bringing both the purchasing group under the umbrella with the accounting group, we can achieve more efficiencies and break down silos that were in place previous to which of me arriving. The other thing that's going on is that we have now started to split our batches for both calendar year 2022 and 2023 in order to ensure that we close out 22 on a strong note. In terms of organizational staff, we have hired a new accountant this past December. He comes to us with over 15 years of accounting and finance experience, and he is a great addition to the team. And then lastly, a few milestone payments. We made the 2% net plant payments to all 4 towns, and that was issued back in December, totaling $860,322, with the following communities being paid out. Reading, $180,154. North Reading, $156,827. Linfield Center, $57,154. And Wilmington, $466,187. And then lastly, we have made our below-the-line payment to the town of Reading, totaling $1.263 million. That was processed back in December. Next slide. This slide here is a preliminary snapshot of our cash balances effective 11/30/2022. As you can see, our cash balances are broken out into 3 specific areas: restricted cash, restricted investments, and unrestricted cash. The lion's share of our cash is in restricted cash, and as we were discussing earlier, we were talking about the rate stabilization fund. We were also talking via email about the energy conservation charge fund. Those are restricted cash funds that, there are certain, let's just say, strings attached to it. The other, the remaining 38% is found within our unrestricted cash balances, as broken down by our operating fund and then our petty cash fund. Next slide. This slide here documents our operating budget versus our actuals. What we have done is, for the 12 months or 11 months here, we've straight-lined our budget to show where we are benchmarking ourselves between our actual operations costs and our budgeted amount. Our actuals are fine, our October financials are finalized, and you can see that with the $20 million that was spent, or $20.9 million that was spent against our budget. This includes general and administrative costs, operating and maintenance costs, and then other expenses, which includes our depreciation and payments to the town. We are looking at our projected November costs. Keep in mind that because we operate essentially a month behind, we are still bringing in additional billings that are coming in to be processed, working with our vendors and so on and so forth. And that will continue through the month of January into February until we close out those books. Moving on to the next slide, we have a snapshot of our capital expenditures through the 30th of November. You'll see that our capital budget our capital budget is $12.54 million. Our capital spending continues to grow, and you'll see that in the month of October, we did have a substantial increase over the prior months, and that was due to the purchasing in the booking of the land for our new Wilmington substation. That alone was $4 million. As of 11/30/2022, we have spent $9.1 million out of our $12.54 million budget. Moving on to the next slide. This one is near and dear to my heart. Prior to my time coming to RMLD, I worked very much within the grants world. And at the MBTA, I was responsible for over $2.5 billion in federal funds that flowed into the authority. One of the areas that I really want to focus in on tonight is our grant submittals. We have submitted, since the beginning of December, 3 concept papers, the first of which is for our MDM AMI grid optimization system, which we were discussing earlier. That concept paper is a $20 million project that we were proposing to the Department of Energy. We have also submitted 2 other grant proposals, which is a flywheel demonstration and the Maple Meadows project for our capital infrastructure needs there. While both Maple Meadows and the flywheel demonstration project are not found within our capital program, the MDM grid program is found within the CIP. The idea is that we want to leverage our federal partners in order to bring in federal funding to assist in us and to shield us from any, taking on of debt, whether it's bonding or what have you. The idea of this is that if we're able to make a demonstration and a pitch to our federal partners, this money will come in and flow into RMLD and reduce our risk when it comes to bonding or any other financial instrument that we use moving forward in terms of our capital program.
And reduce cash from.
And reduce cash, obviously, from
the ratepayers.
From the ratepayers. Ultimately, the idea is that there's a large source of funding out there through the federal government, and by utilizing this, we will leverage our partnerships with the feds. Yes, Commissioner Coulter?
So these are 100% funded projects?
No. So these projects always require a share. So some of them are 50-50%, some of them are, I want to say 35% is the local share. It depends on the actual NOAA. So if we are fortunate enough to be awarded these funds, or actually in this case, if we're granted the opportunity to submit because these are only concept papers, then we will have, we will put forth what our match is in terms of our cash that we have on hand to reduce that exposure within our capital budget.
As an example, on that Maple Meadows one, that 13 million, the project estimate right now, we're still doing a lot of work to move the ball forward. We're trying to keep everybody up to speed. Town of Wilmington's been very supportive. That's probably a $25 million budget item that we haven't formally proposed, but what we're trying to do right now is set the stage and get everything lined up so that when we do propose it for approval, obviously the CAB and the board has to approve, but theoretically almost half of it could be funded with grant dollars. Now, that particular project, it is still worth doing even if we didn't get any grant dollars, but if we get grant dollars, it's that much more valuable from a ratepayer perspective.
Goes in the rate stabilization.
So don't
That's what the
spend it
flywheel
down.
is for.
What is the flywheel demonstration?
It's a big wheel, big heavy wheel. Seriously, that's what it is. It's a giant wheel that spins around.
It's a whole bunch of wheels.
So as a means to essentially dampen any surges within, our load that we provide to our customers within our territory, should there be a circuit that goes down, this will enable us to bridge the gap between when a battery reserve comes back online or when a gas-powered generator boots up.
So it's like a replacement for capacitors in a way?
Actually, what it does, it's gonna cut the transfer time or the transition from one source to another source. So whether you have a generator, standby generator, or battery, whenever, there is an outage or whether you want to bring it online, there is that transitional period that could create a lapse. So flywheel is a magnetic source of energy that would be released in order to cut the gap in that whole transfer time. So it would save, basically you wouldn't feel it, it's like there's no outage.
So we're just setting the stage. This would actually also be at Maple Meadows. It's a power quality, as we just talked about. That would be a more significant portion, not necessarily a 50-50 match. There was another part of the reason why we actually took the initiative to submit the concept paper is that grants are viewed favorably when it's partnership. So this would actually be with another company in Massachusetts, which increases the probability of getting approved. So this is concept right now. We're still setting the stage. So I think the key thing that Ben's trying to impress upon you is first and foremost that he brings a lot of experience in terms of grants, not only securing them, but managing them, because they do need to be managed. And the second element is we are being proactive to set the stage, going back to the very fundamental thing we just talked about with rates, is how do we build out our network, how do we increase the reliability and the resiliency, particularly in the world of changing power supply. So how do we do all that, but not completely on the backs of the ratepayers? So we're looking externally. This is really good news, the work we're doing, and we're out of the gate already.
And then furthermore, while not listed here, we are also submitting comments to the Mass CEC along with the EEA for the Section 40101D program, which includes our upgrade to 13.8 kV. So these are programs that we're working on in addition to outreach to the Department of Homeland Security in order to address some of those concerns that we have on security to ensure that transformers do not get shot up and find ways to
This is good stuff.
to essentially harden our system, but not at the exposure of ratepayers.
So what kind of prospective timeline here? You've got concept papers submitted, do they say within 6 months you'll?
So the timeline for the 4107 program and the 4101 is February, March timeframe in terms of response back, whether we are invited to submit an application for those grants. The 4101D program, that is administered through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that's a formula grant program, meaning that there is approximately $3.5 to $4 million annually set aside for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for programs such as this. So that is late spring is the time frame, but we have to get our comments in by February 17th, which coincidentally is my wife's birthday, so I will not forget either of those.
We'll be early. We'll be early on the presentation, yeah, right.
And then lastly, I am having a meeting with the, she is the liaison to municipalities for MAPC, which is the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission out of Boston, in order to unlock the door and have access to Department of Homeland Security funding for what they call the HSGP program, which is funding in place to provide for security upgrades to our facilities here. So those are just, a snapshot of some of the programs that we're looking into in order to finance these projects that are both within the CIP and aspirational in order to essentially shield our ratepayers from substantial increases as the years go on.
Sounds good.
Yes, Commissioner.
Is grid mod in there?
Excuse me?
Is grid
Grid mod.
Yes.
The grid modernization, sorry.
Yes, so that is the 4107 program.
Stop.
And the grid modernization includes both AMI and MDM on that.
Okay. Yeah,
And that's one of the example of a project that's already in the existing budget. So going back to, what we're trying to do, not only in terms of preparing for future budget, but existing dollars, these might be mechanisms that can actually reduce our capital, the cash for the capital spend.
Correct.
Which again goes back to your request and all of our requests How do we minimize the, minimize the amount that the ratepayers have to pay directly? Because currently, they've paid everything, and now we're trying to figure out alternate ways to make that happen. This is really good stuff.
Is that modernization piece the one that you're going to hear in February, if you're invited to submit
Yes.
details?
Yep.
Okay.
February,
Correct.
March. So,
Next slide, if there are no further questions. Great. So one of the other areas that we're looking at in order to recoup costs is that our finance team is working on properly reclassifying capital expenditures going back 7 years for our pool transmission facilities, expenditures. Historically speaking, going back to 2003, we would essentially we would expense PTF costs. Working with an outside consultant, we are applying the FERC 7-factor test, which includes, determining whether local distribution facilities are nominally in close proximity to our customers, whether local distribution facilities are primarily radial in character, and so on and so forth. The goal of this is, by going back to 2003, we are looking to recast those expenses for transmission and capitalize them in order to essentially recast our depreciation and receive funding back in terms of how those funds were reported and booked in years past. Going forward, the hope and the goal is that we will see an additional $500,000 a year annually to be reimbursed for PTF charges.
Can you say that in layman's
Reimbursement.
terms?
In layman's terms, okay. So essentially, when we were billing out, we were charging, we're still, this is still an existing expenditure.
Right. You've got to recast some historical stuff. But
Correct.
the intention is, we spend money, and these PTF are basically connections to the transmission network. And so there, in our expense budget and our capital budget, we spend money every year to maintain those connections, right? Part of our capital piece. And if we report it properly, we will get reimbursed for a portion of those costs that we already in the budget. So there's an additional $500,000 that we are not collecting right now, that if we do the proper historical paperwork, we can't get money historically, but if we set the stage up properly, then going forward, there is probably $500,000 that we will get reimbursed for, of our expenses that we're already spending, that we'll get reimbursed for. Net,
Reimbursed by whom?
ISO,
By ISO New England.
Yep. Normal process, we just didn't, we had not historically taken the time to do this, and so now we are doing this. You need, yeah.
My apology for being
No,
knee-deep in the
but,
weeds.
like, why? Did we do something
Why what?
incorrectly? But why would we be reimbursed for something historically submitted?
It's not historical. The reason for the historical stuff is just to set the stage that going forward, we have the right paperwork in place to allow us to do it going forward. We won't be able to recoup any historical cost.
Correct.
But 2023 cost, 2024 cost to the tune of $500,000. We have to correct some historical paperwork, but we're only looking at future costs.
In order to unlock those future
Yeah,
costs.
so if there's who's approving the transfer of this cost?
Well, the reimbursement of the cost.
Well.
We're spending the money.
You're reclassifying asset.
Oh, yeah,
That-
so
that
ISO,
now you can, who's approving that
ISO goes
reclassification?
back and, yeah, they approve it to let us do
And
it.
they're allowing us to do that?
What's very common, we probably should have been doing this all along.
Okay.
So that's my question now. If we do this, we're gonna have to go back and restate our financial statements for 7 years.
No.
Why not?
I don't think so.
Because we're reclassing this out of expense into capital.
Going forward,
So
right?
we're doing going
Just going
forward or
forward.
going back 7 years? Seems like we're
No,
gonna
they're not
restate our
changing
last 7
capital,
years.
it's
of-
not capital,
of,
it's still saying
of
capital and
financials.
expense. It's just, it's gonna be now considered pooled transmission facility, where in the past it wasn't classified. So you still spend expense in capital, you're gonna spend capital and expense going forward, but now it's classified as a pooled transmission facility, which ISO will reimburse you for those expenses.
Correct.
And capital expenditures, because it's part of the larger pool that everybody gets a benefit.
Correct.
So because everybody in the area gets a benefit, they gotta they send you money because
I
the
understand.
whole grid is
We're
getting the
going
benefit
back
out of
and
it.
Redoing 7, we're going back 7
No,
years.
because they're not giving you any money for the past.
They're
It's
not-
just going
yeah.
forward. Nothing's
It's
changing.
just saying it stays to go forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Essentially what it is showing that, you know, it is, you know, transmission as opposed to not.
As opposed to
And to,
distribution.
maybe to Phil's point, you don't, do you need to go back all 7 years? If you just need to show that you had this, you just go back 1 year to make sure you got all your ducks in a row, and then you
Yeah.
go forward, right? Why make work going
Yeah,
backwards?
I think Vivek, we just need to go through the proper process, right? And so that's why we have an individual that's helping us work through this, who's helped us all along, but hasn't, but is now helping us on this piece. This is real money going forward in time. This is a real expense that we legitimately should get reimbursed for. And we have to do work to prepare us, to allow us to do that. And so so with some individuals in Hamid's team, on the grid asset side, some work that Ben is doing from the finance side. So the intention is not to restate financials. The goal is just to make sure everything is set historically, so that looking forward, because these are assets that we've already put in
Okay,
place.
so you're saying over 7 years, you would have created different assets, or you would have had different assets over 7 years, and you'll identify which ones you can then use going forward for cross-charging?
It's not 7 years, right? It says several years, it's a FERC 7 factor. So you have to
correct.
prove that it's got
There-
7 factors of benefit, or whatever. You gotta prove, probably in the past several years, that this was an actual pool facility, that there was actual benefit to the region. And if you can prove that those assets provided
Got
actual
it.
benefit, now you can collect on them.
Got it.
It seems
It's a
that we're saying
7-factor
those are
test
capital
that we're using
expenditures.
to show that.
We gotta move them to the balance sheet side.
Yeah, I think so Phil, your question is well taken, and we will make sure we dig into it to make sure that we don't have to restate.
Discussion with the auditors on this one,
Oh, we will.
okay? Because, we're looking, if we're gonna say these things were capital expenditures and we've expensed them, and we're gonna move, and we're saying they were capital expenditures, then we gotta go back and.
They've always been capitalized,
Right,
right?
we gotta
Yeah.
redo our
So-
financials.
So we'll take the action item to, again, we're partway through this process, and we'll report back. At the end of the day, from both ISO's perspective, it is a common practice. We're just setting ourselves up so that we can also benefit, because we, as RMLD and our ratepayers, we are paying this money that legitimately we should be reimbursed for.
I'd also ask the auditors why they didn't bring this up on their side.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's-
well,
I don't know if
Well,
it's.
my clients would say to me, how
Yeah,
come
but
you bring this up?
so we'll look at that, Phil, but I think, anyways, I won't dig any deeper into that one.
Yeah, I don't think anything between expense and capital is gonna change, because FERC accounting is the same for them as it is for everybody in the
Everybody.
industry. So
Yeah.
it's got set of actual accounts that are capital and expense, and there's certain requirements
Yeah.
to be, so what was expense is still expense, what's gonna be capital is still capital.
Yeah.
They're just proving that this was an actual pool transmission facility, that it was used
For a
by the
pool, yeah.
regional grid as a benefit to everybody, not just Reading customers. And then they can get, going forward, compensated for that, because it's a regional benefit.
Going forward.
Going forward.
This
Now,
is
is
a
this-
really good thing.
Now, is this something that Ben brought to the table, being a new set of eyes? How did this come that it's now new? I'm just,
This is probably something, so I was part of the catalyst to get this moving forward. Hamid and Ben have been very supportive. We started working on this actually a year ago. And it as, partially at the prompting of the consultant that does other work for us, to say, you guys are walking away from money. So I prioritized it to say, let's get this done. It's team effort, team effort. And we should be doing this. We should be doing this. So we got work to do. But what we want to impress upon you is that Ben has the capability. He's a finance guy, right? I mean, he understands the nature of our business, but he brings a finance expertise, which is very valuable to RMLD as an entity and to the ratepayers as a result. And so what he's basically kind of walking you through, here are some of the things that we're doing. And, we're talking not a couple $100 here and a couple $100. We're talking millions of dollars that the ratepayers will not have to pay, which, again, a little bit of humor with the rate stabilization. I mean, wherever at the end of the day, all these dollars come from someplace, right? And here what we're basically saying is there are funds outside of RMLD territory and ratepayers that we should be bringing into our ratepayers for the benefit again, the benefit of the ratepayers, because again, our criteria or our charter, reliable, low-cost, non-carbon. That's our charter. And so everything that we can do to maintain that, and our network is now very reliable, right? And it is, relatively speaking, low cost, and we'll talk about power supply in a minute. I will make that fast, I promise. But we are well on our way in terms of being non-carbon compliant. So that was the intention, to just give you an idea of what Ben brings a lot of expertise to the organization. We are
Got it.
We are happy he's here.
Just to go back to why maybe it wasn't classified PTF before, PTF, non-PTF is always a discussion on a lot of transmission projects, as 7-factor test, right? It has to
Yep.
meet 7 factors.
Has to fit.
So it's complicated, and then the transmission system's constantly changing, so what was non-PTF 10 years ago might be PTF today, depending on how the system changed and what they've done for work. So it's complicated. So it's not just a simple answer that something messed up 10, 15
No,
years.
and that was not the implication.
Yeah.
The point being.
No, the question was asked, so I'm trying to explain that things change over time. Something that wasn't PTF 20 years ago could be PTF today, depending on how it's being used. And every transmission project, when it gets submitted and goes through the ISO process, has to go through this acceptance test to figure out if it's PTF or non-PTF. And it's complicated.
It's complicated.
Well, thank you for doing it.
My pleasure. So that is all the slides I have. Are there any further questions?
No.
Joe.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So we're going to talk about power supply. I actually have 2 motions in place. Do we want to do what we did before with rates and read the CAB motion, and then have the discussion on it? And then the BOC, and then have the discussion on it, I'm
Sure.
trying to say?
I'll move that the Citizens Advisory Board recommend that the Board of Commissioners vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Avangrid Renewables for energy, including associated certificates, from an existing wind facility in Connecticut and an existing wind facility in New Hampshire, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence.
Second.
Second, okay, got it. All right.
And I'll read yours. Move that the Board of Commissioners, on the recommendation of the CAB, if they so do, vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Avangrid Renewables for energy, including associated certificates from an existing wind facility in Connecticut and existing wind facility in New Hampshire, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence. Do we have a second?
Second.
Bob Coulter, Board.
Okay, great. So if we do slide 2, so this is power supply. So there are a couple of key points here. We've talked about in the upper left-hand corner there. We've talked about this.
Greg, are you going to talk about both projects? Do you need both motions?
I'll do
done?
one at a time. We'll pause, and then we'll do
Fine.
the next one.
Got
And the setup's the same for both, so we'll do one at a time. It'd be easy. And anyways, it'll be perfect. Actually, I'm going to jump right to slide 3. I mean, we've talked about the key points in slide 2. So, slide 3. So, this is our current portfolio, and it's in your books in front of you, on the left-hand side of slide 3. We, as you guys have known, right, starting in late 2020 and into 21 very aggressively, and then lesser extent in springtime of 2022, but we were very aggressive in terms of recasting and remolding from a strategic perspective, Policy 30, but to change our portfolio to be compliant with the 2021 climate bill that we talked about before. The request there, or the requirement of that climate bill, is not only to encourage electrification, the use of energy, particularly in buildings, which is the air source heat pumps versus fossil fuel, as we talked about earlier, as well as transportation, the use of EVs versus fossil fuel-based transportation. Those are all factors that are outside of RMLD, so we are simply called to be compliant. As we had talked about a year and a half ago, the targets are to be 50% non-carbon by 2030, and then 75, 2040, and then net zero by 2050. So we have basically, and we continue to, but we've basically reoriented our power supply to be both non-carbon, but also to be as resilient and reliable from a couple of different factors. On the left-hand side there, If you look at it, the pink is basically nuclear, the blue is hydro, the green is wind, and the yellow is solar. And so we were very aggressive in terms of the hydro stuff when we went back to 2020 and 2021. We actually had presented to you and approved back in, I believe it was in the November meeting, a hydro project for Falls Village. That press release actually went out today. You'll probably see some articles, hopefully you'll see some articles and some press maybe this weekend or next week in terms of the benefits of hydro for non-carbon in our portfolio and portfolios of MLPs. But the hydro is in good shape. We have several solar projects. That previous slide talked about some of the solar projects. Solars are challenging right now due to the lack of panels. And there was a whole bunch of work relative, not work, there are a whole bunch of federal government policies that slowed down, and COVID, et cetera, that slowed down the import of panels over the past 2 years. That has slowed down several of the projects. One of the projects that we had originally signed up on as part of not just us, but we were part of a bigger group, Milan Solar, ended up being canceled. Some of them are being delayed, some of them are being repriced. We still want solar in our portfolio. Solar is still a good part of our portfolio. And we're going to continue chasing after solar projects. But the other thing that we need to do is also that green area there is fairly lean, and that's wind. And again, what we want to do is to have a balanced portfolio of nuclear, wind, solar, and hydro. And right now, our portfolio is light on wind in particular, and it's also light on solar. So we're continuing to chase down solar projects. We are hoping to be successful in terms of putting a solar project within our territory, which has a whole bunch of benefits. That's the Maple Meadow stuff. But tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about, I wanted to basically get your approval to move forward on 2 different wind projects. One of the things that this slide 3 talks about is risk management. And when we think about risk management, because many of these most of these new resources are not firm, which is they're not guaranteed output, we need to think about making sure that we have risk management on a variety of factors. And I just made some notes here. The generation type, a nice mix of solar and hydro and wind. And as we had talked about late last year, solar and hydro are nice balancing together. Solar tends to be very strong in the middle of the summer, where hydro tends to be weakest. Hydro tends to be strongest in the wintertime and the spring, where solar tends to be weakest. So those 2 together are a nice balance in terms of a seasonality perspective. Hydro is good typically 24 hours a day, whereas solar obviously, anyways, all said and done, we think about generation type. We also think about geography. So we are very specific in terms of making sure that we try not to have generation assets geographically concentrated in any particular area. So you'll see here that these wind projects are across 3 states, and that's on purpose. So as we think about it, there will be a time, the offshore wind projects off of Martha's Vineyard, those are highly concentrated. And we'll cross that concentration bridge when we get there, but that's forecasted to be 17,000 megawatts out of a 24,000 to 27,000 megawatt load for all of New England, concentrated in that one area. That's a whole different discussion. We're not the project developers there. We will take some of that energy off, but we're going to spread our wind and our solar and our hydros geographically around, and we've done that so far. So anyways, just context. Our portfolio is in good shape, but if you go to slide 5. So slide 5, this is the Avangrid, so I'm going to I've got them out of sequence, but it's totally fine. So this is a wind project, Avangrid. These are 2 different facilities, total of about 75 megawatts. One is in western Massachusetts, Hoosac Wind. It's an existing project that was built in 2012. And so the opportunity for us is basically to buy a portion of it, about 16% of the project, starting in 2025. Again, that's a good time in terms of fitting our portfolio. We'd like some earlier, but that's when it becomes available. They do have Mass Class 1 certificates, as we've talked about before. We always want to buy renewable energy with certificates. And in fact, starting in 2030, we are required to buy if we're going to retire the certificates, the certificates need to be associated with them. So we currently don't buy certificates on the open market. We don't need to, but at some point in time, we won't be able to. So when we think about these long-term contracts, we always want to buy the certificates. These are mass class ones. It's a good thing. This particular project, capacity, so you don't care about the details in terms of capacity factor.
Greg, just interrupt for a second. The motion references an existing facility in Connecticut. Should that have read Massachusetts?
It should be Massachusetts and, yes, I'm very sorry, yes. Should be Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Thank you for that, Ken.
Greg, just a quick question on the wind here,
Yeah.
because yes, you said they were constructed in 2000 and when?
2012, 10 years ago.
So it's like, what, 8, 10, 12 years old?
Yep.
Do we have someone who will do due diligence on them to make sure that they're, one, that they're functional, two, that their parts are available for replacement
Yeah.
when they stop working? Because there's been some horror stories about
Well,
that.
in fact.
And I can tell you in Gloucester where there are 3 of these.
Yeah.
One of the vanes dropped off on one of them.
Yeah, I heard about that, yeah.
Which wasn't very pretty.
Yeah. This Avangrid's a large organization. They're pretty experienced in wind. We'll definitely do the environmental due diligence as we've committed to in terms of projects. We will, I don't know if we'll have a third, so this is actually this particular one, both of these, we would be a portion of the purchasers, and we would be purchasing a portion of it that is opening up. We're doing it through E&E. I will ask for a little bit more due diligence on this
I only
particular
mention
one.
it because of
Yeah.
the supply side chain of getting replacement parts. It's been extremely difficult for these. So,
Exactly right, and these ones, these are smaller, these are 1.5
Right.
megawatt turbines, so they're a little bit on the smaller size. The newer ones are gonna be, as we talked about before, the offshore ones are gonna be 14 megawatts, much more significant. These have a pretty good track record. In fact, I'll talk, and when we get to the one up in Maine, the one, which will be a new one, one of the things we did look at is the turbines, since those will be new turbines, we asked specifically about the maintenance crews that are, the factory maintenance crews that are already stationed in Maine, and they're already there. So I think in both of these cases, we don't expect to have any significant problems, but that is definitely a factor when we think about moving equipment.
Right.
Solar panels are different. There's still issues, but they're not as complex as wind turbines are. And that was also, one of the reasons why we work with the 2 hydro teams, Gravity and First Solar. They are experienced people that know how to maintain equipment. And when we're doing, 10, 15, 20-year contracts, 30 years in the case of some of the hydro facilities, that's an important factor. So I feel comfortable with each one of those. This Avangrid one, the benefits, it's not huge, but it is geographically spread. It's got a 30% capacity factor. I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump into those details. Price-wise, it is good. It is below our average wind price, so it'll drag our wind price down, which is good. But all of these, when I put in there 70% above our fully contracted portfolio, our fully contracted portfolio is really well priced, right? So even this is 70% above in today's market, these are both very well priced projects, which is why, and there are several of other ones we had to choose from, but these are the ones that we chose that we thought are worthwhile. So that's the Avangrid one. It would be a site in western Massachusetts, we'll make that edit, and in the center of New Hampshire. So we're asking for approval to move forward. So we have work to do. We've got due diligence, we've got stuff to do, but I'm going to have approval to begin the due diligence and the ability to start creating contracts. It won't actually, the contract probably won't get signed until April, May timeframe, but we want to get approval now to be able to move forward because we need to make commitments.
Through the chair, should he amend his motion to read correctly?
Yes.
Yes. I don't know if I reread the entire motion or just,
Let me ask one question.
I would read the
Avangrid
entire
was doing something offshore, they backed away.
Yeah.
Do you know what that was?
Yeah, so they backed away because what they basically said, the commitment that they had made to the state, these are all state-run programs, and they said basically the prices, which actually are a little bit above what these are, to build the new assets offshore, they couldn't meet the original contracted price given supply chain issues, so they wanted to basically reprice. It'll probably still get built, but there'll be a lot of the politics of all that will be significant, which means that most likely those offshore projects that were originally intended to be 26, 27, 28 will probably be 3 to 4 years delayed. All the more reason for us to,
They're financially sound.
oh, financially sound. Yeah, no, this is about the project itself,
Okay.
the financials of the project. Good question, no, thank you.
So, let me replace the original motion with the new motion that the Board of Commissioners, that the Citizens Advisory Board recommend that the Board of Commissioners vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Avangrid Renewables for energy, including associated certificates, from an existing wind facility in western Massachusetts and an existing wind facility in New Hampshire, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence.
Second.
You want to take a vote? All in
Ken Walter,
favor?
aye.
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 On our side. Moving the Board of Commissioners and the recommendation of the Citizens Advisory Board, vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Avangrid Renewables. I think they got an LLC after this, I'm not so sure about that. For energy, including associated certificates from an existing wind facility in Massachusetts, an existing wind facility in New Hampshire, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence.
Second.
John Stempek seconds, Marlena Beta, aye.
Mr. Pacino, aye?
Talbot, aye.
Mr. Stempak, aye?
Mr. Coulter.
Thank you. Then the other one would be, so we should do the,
Similarly, this one should be reworded, to say Maine instead of Connecticut.
yes, it should.
So, move that the Citizens Advisory Board recommend that the Board of Commissioners vote to accept the General Manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Patriot Renewables for energy, including associated certificates, from a to-be-built wind facility in Maine, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence.
Second.
And then you guys need to read, and then I'll,
Yeah, go ahead.
They voted? No, I got the motion.
Well, he's gonna talk about Patriot, but
Yeah.
what we did before was we read them in tandem,
Okay.
each motion.
Yeah.
It doesn't,
No, I just, have them vote, because we're saying we're on the recommendation.
I
So we
agree.
get their vote, we
I
can't. we
agree.
can't
All
vote.
right, so do the Patriot.
okay, that's fine. So this is on slide 4. This is another wind project. This is also an onshore project to be built in Maine, so this has not yet been built. One of the issues and one of the things that we dug deep into already was connection to transmission. Transmission is very important coming out of Maine. This one has got a very nice transmission connection. We will continue to push on that before we do any contracting, but that's an important piece. The other thing, back to the discussion, Commissioner, that you mentioned, is terms of the support of the turbines themselves. These will all be new turbines, but we want to make sure that the support base is in there, and it is there. Patriot, which is based out of Quincy, is also a very experienced wind developer. So they've got lots of projects under their belt, which is another reason why we like going to projects like this. This one would be about 40% of the project output. We are probably going to do 60,000 megawatt hours a year, but there's an opportunity we might actually go up to 70,000 megawatt hours a year. That would be 10% of our purchases as of now. When it comes in, it'll probably fall down to 7 to 8%, which is more of the area that we're like. So we're trying to basically anticipate the load growth that we're expecting coming in, but on the industrial side as well. 25 years, so it'll be started 2025 by the time they get it done. The site, they have site control, that's a critical issue. So anyways, and we would be one of several E&E based, or several MLPs that would basically take this project. So we would be one of several. Again, Mass Class 1 certificates, which we like. Also, it's well-priced. And that's a quick summary. We can get into more details about it, but it's a more significant area in the central part of Maine. And it has, again, the profile of wind looks good. Capacity factor. Sorry. Questions on this particular project? Same basic structure, but this is new, different developer, new equipment,
Any
well supported.
expected big hurdles to get this
built?
Nope. We'll go through the proper due diligence on the environmental stuff anyways, but, and I want to say it's in the middle of nowhere, that's not quite. an
But you said the
understatement, but-
transmission is good, right?
Transmission is good, yep. We're gonna keep pushing on that one, but the transmission, it's near uncongested transmission lines, which is a critical issue. Because one of the other projects that we'd originally commissioned on the solar side it was not near, did not have good transmission access, and so as a result of that, they bailed.
Yeah. I have one question about our portfolio. I look at the wind to solar ratio today. It's more, if I read this correctly, it's more wind and less solar.
In terms of, so what's on slide 3 is the contracted piece. The green is wind and the yellow
Yeah.
is solar.
So if I read it, this says there's a lot more wind in our system today than solar.
We're light, what this says is that we're low on wind in our portfolio. We need to add wind to our portfolio. That's what the chart on slide 3 says. It's because, as I look, the way I want you to focus, Vivek, is if you look at the green bar in each one of those years.
Yeah, so green is bigger than the yellow bar, right? So
Yeah, that's true.
Today.
That's true in 23 and 24.
Yeah, that's why I said today.
I'm so sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes,
And-
you're
and-
absolutely right.
And going forward, solar is going to dominate. So just a question, have you thought about, as you build this mix of wind and solar, is there some general thinking about what should be the right mix of wind and solar so that you can hedge?
Yeah.
For New England, what's the appropriate mix? Or then plan your battery use accordingly, but just.
Well, the battery is a whole nother discussion, but again, so roughly, the intention is to make the nuclear portfolio about a third, somewhere between 35 and 36%. To put the hydro somewhere between 20 and 25%. To put solar somewhere on the lower end of the 20s, and to put wind in the mid 20% range. That's roughly how we're thinking about it. Ultimately, we have to get out, well, in terms of the majority of the day-to-day purchases, the legislation is requiring us to be non-carbon. Now, that is going to take some time. There's a whole discussion in terms of how much carbon, natural gas in particular, we have in the portfolio as quote-unquote backup. That's a whole nother discussion. But in terms of the mix, these two projects, we will take more.
Because, I mean, the mix could be like, this is actual power supply, right? The mix could be what your capacity is, but.
Wait, so one of the things that we're in the process of doing, Vivek, is having the IRD team focus more on, I'll say for right now, hourly load forecast and hourly supply forecast. Because what historically we used to do is we bought power in 3 blocks, right? On peak, off peak, and weekends. Now, because wind and solar and hydro all have different portfolios over the course of a day and over the course of the season, it's a much more complicated model. But we know, for example, wind is somewhat similar to, so to answer your question, yes, we have a sense of what we think it should look like. And these projects fit into it, and we need more wind behind it.
Yeah, no, it's
But there's-
more from a
but
risk.
there's a lot more work to do
Yeah,
to-
it's from a risk mitigation point.
Oh, yeah.
That I'm asking that,
Yeah.
when could you expect, like, if you have poor insolation days, if you don't have wind, then, you have a big problem.
Right, and so that's exactly the analysis that we are trying to do on a more detailed basis going forward. I mean, we don't have it all done. I mean, we have the big picture, like we're starting to migrate into that, but that modeling is rather sophisticated, and we're just getting started on it. But in terms of being able to have a portfolio that allows us, that keeps us in the game, that we continue to build out the portfolio. And again, You know, this isn't the only projects that we've looked
No,
at.
no, no, but you
Yeah.
said this is going to be 10%, this could be 10%, right?
That could be 10%, exactly
So
right.
that's significant, if 10% is like,
Well, it could be 10% of the current, but by the time, you know, when this thing's actually running, it'll probably be 9%, and it'll slowly drop down, because
yeah, but you want 20% to be wind, so this is going to be a big chunk of your
it'll be a
wind
big chunk of
supply.
it, yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's geographically separate. And that's, anyway, so, that whole mapping in terms of how you manage it is a fascinating puzzle, but that's for another discussion. We'll come back with some models in a year from now saying, here's how, anyways, different topic. Other questions on
We've made a
Do you all
motion.
have questions? We are good.
We have
just
to
the
vote on that.
Yeah,
Massachusetts?
so,
Okay.
call for vote?
Yeah,
So, aye?
Aye.
aye.
Move to the Board of Commissioners on the recommendation of the Supervisory Board, vote to accept the general manager's recommendation to execute a contract with Patriot Renewables for energy, including associate certificates, from a to-be-built wind facility in Maine, the state of Maine, contingent on appropriate environmental due diligence. Second. Esposito, aye?
Marlena Beta,
Step
aye.
back, aye.
Coulter, aye.
Thank you.
Who seconded that? Was that Bob or Dave?
I think it's John.
I did.
Well, yeah. Pick one.
Either way.
What did you say?
We said aye.
You said it, aye.
I think all three of you.
Say
All
aye.
of us seconded it. It was seconded
Pick the one you like.
2.1, 2.3, and 2.6.
six times.
So
I
our
think
next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, February 15th at 7:30.
Okay.
We have a few more Wednesdays before we go back to our Thursday schedules, like March 15th and April 19th. February, just a reminder that for February accounts payable is Bob Coulter on payroll, and the CAB meeting is Commissioner Stempak. But, John, you said you couldn't attend it, right?
Yes, that's right, I won't be there, so Bob, I think, had said he would do that for me, right? I think.
Yep.
Said he
I
would.
don't know the,
Could you,
So you guys have
yeah.
is the CAB gonna choose their next meeting date, I guess for after February? Do you have more than February, past February on your calendar already?
Kathleen knows where we are. So,
All right.
So we'll
Sure,
get back to you.
Kathleen.
It's just confusing
I
because,
have March 23rd, Thursday,
Okay.
March 23rd, that's going after February. So it was Thursday, February 23rd, and March 23rd.
Yep. Yep.
And that might be it.
So at this point, the CAB.
we'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, no, it just was on the, so the CAB is welcome to adjourn your meeting if you choose.
Yeah, we'll do that.
But one CAB member is to stay for some coverage. Hi, Jason.
Okay, can we get a motion to adjourn?
Move that the CAB adjourn.
Second.
Okay.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Hamid.
Not gonna stay for the best part?
Nothing personal.
Allowed.
Nothing personal.
I'm gonna jump on this.
All right, thank you.
Oh, yeah, you should.
Yeah, take it easy, now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hamid Jafari, our Director of E&O,
Yeah.
here for some procurement requests.
Yeah, we want really.
Stay?
IFP
Thank you very, very much.
2022-38 for Padron switches be awarded to Wesco Distribution, Inc. for a total of $252,138 pursuant to Mass General Laws, Chapter 164, Section 56D, on the recommendation of General Manager.
We have a second? Out loud?
Second.
Thank you, John.
Okay, for the discussion?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
sure. This is basically the two special switches that, you know, for the special automation scheme. This is the second time that this IFB is going out to bid. The first time went out on February 2022, and we sent it to 11 companies, and we received 3 bids. All 3 bids, they did not meet the technical specifications. And the reason for that being because these are a special automation scheme.
We got 2 reclosers out on Concord Street, and we got 2 switches that they should work in cooperation with those 2 automated switches out on Concord Street. These switches, they're a special unit for motor operator unit that being used for the industrial park, River Industrial Park in North Reading, and they took lots of exceptions. Some of them, they said their control is not synchronized with the controls on the poles on those automation schemes. Some of them, they said you have to remodify the pad and, completely dismantle the existing automation scheme and go to the new one, which would cost more money. So the second time we went out with the same model, which is SNC, and with a control that it could be synchronized with the existing automation scheme. And also another advantage that these 2 units they have is that once we do that, actually what we could use those automation scheme out on Concord Street, use them for analog devices as a spare units. So it's going to serve dual purposes. And these units also, they fit perfectly into our overall automation scheme for FDIR and, for all those switches, they talk and open and, isolate the fault and close to the, to the open points and here, there. So that's why that, it's only SNC, they responded to the bid. And actually the price that we got, it's a very good price. And if you take out the automation scheme that we have out on the pole, use it elsewhere for analog, that's another $100,000 savings. That would go somewhere else.
Great.
I'm just
Any?
confused. This letter is about Wesco, and then the motion.
Wesco, yeah. Wesco is the representative of SNC, so Wesco was the one who responded to the bid, the only bid.
Okay. I have Arthur J. Hurley on mine. That's just mine. Okay. So any further discussion? No, okay.
Spacino, aye?
Mr. Stempak, aye?
How would I? Mr. Coulter, aye.
Marlena Beta, aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Move that the RMLD Board of Commissioners approve the minutes of July 21st, 2022 meeting on the recommendation of General Manager and the Board Secretary.
We have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions about the minutes or comments? Okay, then all those in favor, Marlena Beta, aye.
Spacino, aye?
Mr. Stempak, aye?
Mr. Coulter, aye.
Okay, now the next one is the executive session. So the department sent me a lot of minutes of executive session with recommendations. In terms of many of those, I agree with most of them. There are some because there's some ongoing issues. There were a couple because there's some personalities involved in those 2. I think I asked only one was recommended to be released, and I as explained to the department, that was one that should not be released because there's an individual involved in that one. So I don't know if we've got anything in the book or anything that we need to vote on anything here.
So next executive session.
At the next session, we will vote on that. I mean, some of them went back to like 2000 by itself.
Yeah, 2000, right.
It was like reminiscing of these people that I saw the names, like the history of their names.
So for the February 15th meeting, we'll revisit that. And also in the February 15th meeting on the agenda, could we please, because I forgot to ask you, the status of Palmer biomass plant, because the end of March is around the corner and April 1st is the...
I'll do a quick summary.
Any other...
Is there any rumblings on that of renewal or something? No.
The developers filed a suit against the state to try and get extensions, but at the end of the day, we're still out. So there's paperwork to be filed at the very end of March, which we will file, but fundamentally it won't impact us in any way, and we have no role in that project.
Bob, quick curiosity question. You go to Maine, biomass, right?
Say what?
Maine is okay, biomass is okay in Maine. So, let's just say, it's, biomass is not in our portfolio, correct?
No.
Okay, never mind. Retract the question. Never mind.
Any other agenda ideas for the open session part of February or March? Okay. You think of anything, let us know.
But it's probably, I know you were thinking about it, but entering into a contract with the vendor for a cash amount, rather than going out every time you want to go out and buy something.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that, but if you have time for that, I know that might be difficult for you to.
I can explain.
You're good, yeah, we're already,
Yeah, come up on the microphone.
yeah.
Actually, yeah, we are for a number of devices. We are doing that for pad mount switch gears, like these two special units that, were exceptions. For the rest of those pad mount switch gears, we have been doing that. We have been doing it for the SCADAmate and interrupter switches as part of the overall automation scheme. We've gone to 5 years contract that, we don't have to keep coming back for bidding. So once we go on every year, it's going to go there. And we're trying to do that for the transformers as well. So transformers are a little bit difficult and more challenging because, because of the supply chain disruptions, it's hard to pinpoint and say that, with those escalating factors being added to it, and they don't know what the next year would bring, okay? And the crisis that we're going right now, I guess in the United States, there's only one or two transformer core manufacturers that, it's basically everything is going through them, and there are more and more delays. We're doing good in inventory. I'm getting calls actually from other systems that to see that, if we can, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, we have, with this supply chain. Yeah.
Don't sell the ball.
Yeah. No, I feel very comfortable with our inventory. We got good transformers, pad mounts, overhead, and we just awarded the new transformer bid for pad mount transformers and also the overhead for $4.5 million that the board approved. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, it's
Cable too, yeah. I think.
yeah. The cable we are doing fine too. We're getting some delivery in March. We're getting another delivery in June.
What Bob's suggesting is we
Yeah.
gotta do, like we're doing the transformer. we
Yeah,
gotta do
the
that
same
with
thing
cables
with the
too.
cables too. Yeah, the cables they're not that bad because it's
Right
but
now.
right now
I
and
think
the
we're getting-
poles
we're getting a heads
were
up here.
yeah. We are ahead of the game. We are ahead of the schedule. So.
Thanks. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
appreciate that, thanks.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll move that the RMLD Board of Commissioners adjourn.
Second?
Anybody yes?
Aye. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I vote we get Ben a sign, a nameplate.
Oh, we got minutes, yeah.
Oh, Ben, these are nameplate, right.
He's still relatively new.
Is there a probationary period?
Yeah.
Next 3 years.
Well, he can get through the probation.
I finally got the impossible.
Oh, yeah, Ben, absolutely.
I will,
Yeah, would you? Yeah, okay, that's pretty wild. What a small world.
Where
right?
are you
Yeah,
talking about?
That's great.
Overall, yeah. You're in there, yeah.
But they had nothing but good things to say.
Well, I will,
I questioned their judgment.
Depends on when you ask me, right? Depends when I asked you. We just spent 2.5
Yeah, well, that's right. I guess I should ask you tomorrow when you're warm as opposed to frozen.
Yeah.